some good points there. Hybrid war, Vijay's concept there is such an important concept because it always is, there's always multiple strategies that are being used at once or that are being layered. And someone talks about inventing reality. It always involves a propaganda war too, in the US as well as usually in the country that they're attacking. So there's all these different methods that happen simultaneously, including the embargo, to infiltrate and destabilize these countries. And it's worked many times. Not every country has been as successful as Cuba in defending against it. But and to go back to what we started this conversation with, that's basically what my Venezuela book, the new one's going to be, is an analysis of the U.S. hybrid war. An analysis of the U.S. hybrid war, plus, the way that the U.S. uses Venezuela as a talking point to stifle socialist construction here, tells us not to organize for socialism because what about Venezuela? But other than that, it's an analysis of the hybrid war and the sanctions. Like you brought up how the sanctions are always changing. I've done a bunch of pieces on Venezuela now. Every time I go to the U.S. State Department website, it changes, and thankfully the U.S. State Department is nice enough to just tell you who they're sanctioning and how they're doing it. But every time that I go to research Venezuela, the number of sanctions that they placed on Venezuela has increased and it's changed. So yeah, it's fluid and constantly adapting to what can best strangle this country. Or like recently, the U.S. needed some energy from Venezuela, so they released some of the sanctions and said, okay, you can sell oil as long as you only sell it to us, so we can use it to wage a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. But yeah.
And these actions are internationally condemned, by the way. A little bit less with respect to Venezuela. I think more people are buying the propaganda, but with respect to Cuba, every United Nations General Assembly vote for the last 30 years has voted unanimously in favor of the U.S. lifting the blockade. It's really only the U.S., Israel, sometimes Ukraine that hops in and votes against it. So we have, of course, the largest empire, an apartheid state, and a government, where fascists can do whatever they want and have a whole lot of power. So yeah, basically the whole world is in favor of the U.S. lifting this blockade, but yet it doesn't do it.
Right. Someone also says Parenti's Inventing Reality predates Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. That's correct, and Inventing Reality is a better book. So thank you for bringing that up. I just think manufacturing consent is a good term. All right, so this video from Ben Norton goes into the specifics of the U.S. coup attempts in Venezuela. I am going to play it at 1.25. I'll play it at 1.5 speed, and we'll probably skip through it because it's really long. But yeah, let me know if you want me to stop it at any point, Carlos. But I'm going to play it here, and I'm also going to run and refill my water, and I'll be right back. But
it's not often that U.S. government officials openly admit that they plan coups around the world, overthrowing elected governments. Now, there is a video clip that went viral of Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, openly admitting that he has experience organizing coups d'etat, and he criticizes Donald Trump, saying Trump is not competent enough to organize a coup inside the U.S., whereas he boasts, I have organized coups around the world in other countries. And specifically, when asked in a follow-up question by CNN anchor Jake Tapper, John Bolton singles out Venezuela. Now, before I play this video clip, I want to explain that in this video, I wanted to provide more in-depth analysis. This video clip has gone viral and has been reported even in mainstream outlets. But in this video clip, you'll see John Bolton talks about a book that he published, a memoir, in 2020. And I read through his book, all of the sections about Venezuela. And in this video, I'm going to summarize what he admits in this book about the many different U.S. government-backed coup attempts against Venezuela's democratically elected government. So here are...
Sorry, I missed it. Is this Bolton's book or Trump?
Bolton.
Okay. I knew he had done a book, but...
These incredible clips, very revealing video clips from this CNN interview that John Bolton did. This is the former U.S. National Security Advisor for Donald Trump with CNN anchor Jake Tapper. And then after, I'll provide more historical context and analysis.
One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup. I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work.
I do want to ask a follow-up. When we were talking about what is capable, what you need to do to be able to plan a coup,
And you cited your expertise having planned coups. I'm not going to get into the specifics, but successful coups? Well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful. Not that we had all that much to do with it, but I saw what it took for an opposition to try and overturn an illegally elected president, and they failed. The notion that Donald Trump was half as competent as the Venezuelan opposition is laughable.
So not only, and this is what I made a TikTok about this, not only does he admit to plotting coups, but he says you have to be smart to do it. Which is like Juan Guaido. That's one of the biggest international lol cows, just international laughing stocks in the world that this U.S. has wasted so much money on. And literally the last coup attempt in Venezuela, some of the people had airsoft guns. They literally didn't even have real guns, and they were stopped by Venezuelan fishermen before they even hit land. Like, oh, these are geniuses. But then he says, you know, I've seen an unsuccessful coup, but Juan Guaido and the Venezuelan opposition, they're way smarter than Trump. Like, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, right. It's, I mean, how smart are you when the opposition that you fund, wherever they go in public, they're getting chairs thrown at them. And when you send mercenaries that are stopped by just everyday fishermen, it's absurd. And the fact that this guy can say that and not be in prison the next day shows that there is no real justice in the American justice system, because all of this is illegal. It's all illegal. And a country that's actually governed by laws and that actually follows its laws would have people like this in prison.
Literally. I mean, if it's almost like beating a dead horse at this point, because Chomsky has been saying every U.S. president should be in prison if the Nuremberg laws or Nuremberg trials were upheld, which is when they sentenced all the not all the Nazi war criminals after World War II, because a lot of them were filtered into the U.S. and British State Departments. But yeah, I mean, these people should be in The Hague. People like George Bush is giving $1 million speaking or doing $1 million speaking engagements, or people like John Bolton. And these are some of like the most vicious war criminals in the world, not just indirectly funding imperialism, but like directly managing the overthrow of sovereign nations. You
know how dumb you have to be so that the opposition you fund ends up becoming like a global meme? Like, one of the best memes the Marxist-Leninist left has ever came up with are the ones where whenever something happens to a government, Guaido declares himself interim president. He's interim president of like 32 countries. Like, he governs half the world by now. But yeah, it's just ridiculous. Like, when I saw that, it kind of, I was watching Breaking Bad at the same time, and I was seeing Walter White just crumble because he wanted to get credit for being smart. And it reminded me of that, except that Walter White is perhaps a bit smarter than John Bolton. But yeah, big egos.
True. Yes, it's like when he's done all this hard work behind the scenes to overthrow governments. He's like, oh, I just want somebody to give me a pat on the back. He's too narcissistic to do it in secret. He's got to come out and brag.
But I think I feel like there's other stuff you're not telling me, though. I'm sure there is.
Well, there you go. Those are the words of one of the most notorious neoconservatives in Washington. For people who don't know, John Bolton was a significant ambassador in the George W. Bush administration and an architect of the Iraq War. And then he was brought back by the Donald Trump administration and made the national security advisor, which is the top national security position. People like Henry Kissinger had previously been national security advisor, also Brzezinski, the famous imperial strategist. And John Bolton was also the director of one of the most notorious neoconservative organizations in Washington, the Project for the New American Century, which outlined the plans for U.S. unipolar hegemony. After the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the end of the First Cold War, the Project for the New American Century really created this idea of U.S. unipolar hegemony, of the U.S. being the only superpower in the world. John Bolton is really the epitome of the warmonger. He is the archetype of the neoconservative warmonger in Washington. And he has never seen a war that he didn't totally embrace and love. Here's an article back in 2018 when he was first made national security advisor for Donald Trump in Bloomberg. And the headline, Bolton's worldview, bomb Iran, okay to strike North Korea first. Of course, people know the DPRK, North Korea, has nuclear weapons. But according to John Bolton, the U.S. should carry out a so-called preemptive attack on a nuclear-armed country. And he has constantly pushed for bombing Iran. Like I said, he was an architect of the Iraq War. So this guy is a complete unabashed war criminal. And I published an article about this over at multipolarista.com all of the sources that I cite in this episode here will be available in this article. I will link to it in the description below. The article is titled "Trump Advisor John Bolton Admits Planning U.S. Coups in Venezuela and Beyond." And I begin this article with the video clip that I just showed from CNN, but there are a lot of other details that I want to discuss today, including I read through his book, which provides a lot of information about the U.S. coup attempts in Venezuela. But I also want to show another video clip here. And in order to do this, I'm going to go through the history of the U.S. coup attempt in Venezuela that began in 2019. Now, I should say that that was not the first.
I just want to pause here before he goes into the Venezuela coups, because we'll probably have some specific things to say about those. But a lot of these concepts that we come up with as anti-imperialists, like multipolarity, which is actually the name of Ben Norton's new website, Multipolarista, come from the imperialists themselves. So, like, if you read the CIA documents that have been released, or that like Vijay Prashad uses to write his book Washington Bullets, they admit this stuff. Like, we are looking for a US dominated unipolar hegemony, where we can they'll have fancy ways of saying it, but we want to have tentacles that control all the media, control all the education, so that ultimately we can control the economics, so that we can and they also talk about using, various financial institutions to do this as well, which is what Vijay does in his book, Washington Bullets, which I have back there, which basically talks about how modern imperialism works. And it's like the CIA and folks like John Bolton, especially with their documents that were private but have now been leaked or released, they'll say, openly what the imperialist strategy is, to create this unipolar US dominated globe. So it's really useful to study that and, study what the imperialists are saying, study what their strategies are. Because a lot of times, especially their internal documents, will just state it out in the open. And if you look at like by example, the current U.S. proxy war with Russia, this is something that's been years in the making, right? The U.S. was trying to do a coup in Ukraine for years before 2014 when they were able to. And then since then, there's been an 8-year war in the Donbass waged by U.S. right-wingers as they've attempted to get closer to Russia and make themselves a threat to Russia. And, it probably would have commenced if Hillary Clinton would have won the election in 2016, but she lost to Trump. So we got Russiagate, which is, Hillary would have won and we could have started war with Russia right away, but Russia rigged our elections. Isn't Russia bad? Don't you want more war with Russia? So these are sort of broad strategies that are cooked up in think tanks or cooked up by neoconservatives like John Bolton, which we need to understand in order to directly combat.
U.S. coup attempt in Venezuela. There have been many. If we go back to 2002, this was 3 years after Hugo Chavez, the revolutionary socialist, first entered office in Venezuela democratically. Hugo Chavez won the 1998 election. He became president in 1999. And then 3 years into his term in 2002, the U.S. government, the Bush administration, backed a coup that was briefly successful. But Hugo Chavez was so popular that the rank and file of the military rebelled against this U.S.-backed coup and put him back in power. Again, he was the legitimately democratically elected president. And there's a good documentary about that. It's called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. So I'm not talking about that coup today. I'm going to talk about one of the many other coup attempts. There were many more coup attempts.
And that one's kind of an amazing coup attempt if y'all want to look it up. I don't know, Carlos, if you know, but I don't know if that's ever happened before, where the U.S. actually deposed a leader and then the people got out in the streets on such a level that the U.S. was like, okay, we have to bring him back, because the U.S. like literally brought Chavez back to Caracas after deposing him, but and put him back in power. But yeah, that might be unprecedented.
It is, right? The closest thing to it is Bolivia, that they were able to come back into power within a year. And that's still like, if it wasn't for Hugo Chavez, that itself would be almost unprecedented. But it shows how well they were able to solidify socialist consciousness in their population. But yeah, I mean, within a few days, they had to give Chavez back. Yeah, I don't think that's ever happened. Like, I know that they did a similar kidnapping on Manuel Zelaya, and they took him to like a forest and like left him there and they took him out through a helicopter. But there wasn't like the level of popular uprising that there was in Venezuela, especially not within the rank and file in the military. Which one of the interesting things about Venezuela is in part that Chavez had been inspired by the Peruvian, not socialist, but almost like left-wing populist. He could be called like a soft socialist. The name is slipping me, but from in the 70s, there was like a left-wing coup in Peru, and the person that came to power was from the military ranks, and he had a training event that Hugo Chavez was in, and he ended up being very inspirational for Chavez. And so Chavez also came from the military. So the fact that they had that connection to the military prevented the conditions that existed in Bolivia that allowed the coup to succeed, which was the flipping of the military.
Yes, and the thing with Venezuela is Chavez wasn't even a socialist until 2005 openly. Like, Chavez is a great leader, and he was instrumental in the Bolivarian Revolution, but it's really from the people. The revolution would have collapsed, during that coup if it wasn't for the mass grassroots support for Chavez. And there have been many times since then where the Chavistas, the people on the ground, have held Chavez and held the government to socialism, have criticized their own government and said, no, this is what you need to do. Because it's a revolution where the people have the power, not just this top-down dictatorship that the fucking lying empire tells us it is.
And the Peru guy is Juan Velasco. I had the name slip, but Juan Velasco. Yeah.
After 2002, but the most high-profile coup attempt was, of course, in 2019 with U.S. coup puppet Juan Guaido. Now, many of us at the time, us independent critical journalists, anti-imperialists, we argued that the U.S. government was carrying out a coup attempt. And some people smeared us as conspiracy theorists or Russian propagandists, all this ridiculous nonsense, these ad hominem attacks. Well, we now have one of the key architects of that coup attempt, John Bolton, admit that it was a coup attempt that he was involved in. Now, in that video clip, of course, he downplays his involvement, but we all know that it was the U.S. government behind that coup, pulling the strings. And his book says a lot. It provides a lot of information about that. But I want to provide a few other details about this. Now, in the article that I wrote over at multipolarista.com, I talk about how this coup with Juan Guaido began in January 2019 when the Donald Trump administration declared this very young, little-known right-wing opposition politician, Juan Guaido, was supposed interim president of Venezuela, they declared. Now, Guaido has never participated in a presidential election. Still today, he never has. He hasn't won a single vote in a presidential election, whereas Maduro has won millions of votes in presidential elections. But of course, the U.S. refused to recognize the legitimately elected constitutional president, Nicolas Maduro, and instead recognized this puppet, Juan Guaido. And
it's something where, like, Guaido is the head of the National Assembly because the opposition won National Assembly election in 2015. Even though Venezuela is a dictatorship who rigs the elections, apparently sometimes they let the opposition win. So then in Venezuela's constitution, he's like, if like Maduro and the next 3 people who are socialists were to die, Juan Guaido would take power. But the opposition doesn't have the National Assembly anymore. They haven't won the election, so it literally doesn't even make any sense. Juan Guaido is literally just a guy who the U.S. has now, is still declaring the president of Venezuela. It's such a freaking joke.
Right. And what's interesting is that the discourse that they use to talk about that, it's always like they always bring up the word democracy, right? Which doesn't really mean anything when it comes out of the mouths of these people. It was the same thing that happened with Guaido, someone that was unelected, that was 3rd or 4th in line. He ends up becoming president and then interim president in the eyes of these people, and then somehow that's democratic. The same thing with Jenny Añez in Bolivia. Like, her party had gotten less than 5% of the vote, and they just shoved her into the presidency. And the way that they're able to just play this off as democracy is just like next level mental gymnastics.
It is truly absurd.
The same week, on January 23rd, that was when Juan Guaido declared himself fake president, and the U.S. immediately recognized him, and the U.S. forced countries around the world to recognize him. That same week, John Bolton did an interview on Fox Business in which he stated very clearly that the U.S. goal was to get access to Venezuela's oil, and he said that U.S. corporations were in contact with the government, they were having discussions, and they wanted access to Venezuela's oil. So here's that video clip. Again, this is the same week as the beginning of the U.S.-backed coup attempt in Venezuela.
We're looking at the oil assets. That's the single most important income stream to the government of Venezuela. We're looking at what to do to that. We want everybody to know we're looking at all this very seriously. We don't want any American businesses or investors caught by surprise. They can see what President Trump did yesterday. We're following through on it.
So if you think of a company like Citgo, which is owned by PDVSA, which is the state-run oil company there in Venezuela, we have a lot of those Citgo assets right here in the U.S. Is that something, for example, sir, that you're looking at?
Yeah, well, we're in conversation with major American companies now that are either in Venezuela or in the case of Citgo here in the United States. I think we're trying to get to the same end result here. You know, Venezuela is one of the three countries I call the troika of tyranny. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of the United States. We both have a lot at stake here, making this come out the right way.
So he's admitting that the goal of imperialism in Venezuela is oil, which is crazy. But of course, as Marxists, as people who have read Lenin's Imperialism, we understand this. We know that that's the goal of imperialism. But when he's talking about there with working together with the oil companies, I remember I wrote about this for my thesis. The State Department literally just went to the largest oil companies who were supposed to, they had deals with Venezuela. We'll refine this amount of oil. We'll help you export this amount of oil. But because that oil is coming from Venezuela, they had to pay a certain amount to the government, which the government then invests in social programs. So it wasn't even, because these are multinational companies. It wasn't Venezuela saying this is all ours, because they didn't have the ability to nationalize it all outside of PDVSA, their state oil company. But they said, if you're going to be an international company, a multinational company making tons and tons of money off Venezuela's oil, you have to pay a certain amount of that revenue to the government so we can feed our people and make sure our people have medicine. And the U.S. said, of course not. We need 100% of that money. We can't just take these minor profits. We need super profits. And the State Department went to these oil companies and they stole Venezuela's oil. They took the oil that they currently had from Venezuela, took it, stole it, and then just dipped and then just left Venezuela, which is how they're now in a situation where they have more oil reserves underground than any other country in the world. But they lack energy because they can't refine any of this oil, because a lot of the skilled workers have left the country because of the embargo and because of Colombian and U.S. imperialist bribes trying to choke the country off from skilled workers. But also they don't have a lot of the equipment and machinery needed to refine oil, because the U.S. State Department went to all these corporations and said either steal Venezuela's oil and abandon them. And they did. And then the U.S. is over here talking about how Venezuela is a dictatorship because the government owns their oil company, or because the government works together with their oil industry. Like, we just told our oil industry to starve this country, and it's the government telling our oil industry what to do in order to make people poorer and hold back development and overthrow a sovereign nation. Is that not dictatorial? Is that not what a dictatorship would do?
Yeah, it's a topsy-turvy world that they're looking at. It's completely flipped upside down. I don't know if they've ever been as explicit about their aims as the Bolton Trump administration was, and I think that's really the danger of that the financial capitalists had with having them on as the leadership of the country. The finance capital prefers the Democrats, right? And they're very explicit about this because they're smarter, they're more sinister, and when they try to attain their aims, they're not going to be as open as Bolton in saying that, look, this is good for our companies. We're trying to get their oil, and throw keywords, tyranny, democracy here and there. Like, most people are smart enough to realize that what he just said was that we need to overthrow the government of Venezuela in order to make it easier for American oil companies to cipher off super profits from oil in Venezuela. It's very easy to understand, but if you use the discourse of the Democrats of liberalism, it's much harder to decipher, because they critique Venezuela, and they're not explicit about what they want. They say, look, Maduro is oppressing LGBTQ people, and they mix in wokeism in order to legitimize the attempts of the attacks of imperialism. And they're a hell of a lot better at getting the job of finance capital done and of monopoly capital done than the Republicans.
Right. The U.S., enforces sanctions, but like under the Trump administration, like we were talking about earlier, Iran tried sending Venezuela some oil, and the military literally took the oil, brought it back to Houston, and then sold it. So they pirated it. Normally that doesn't happen. Normally the sanctions are just enforced, or they're covertly stolen, right? The U.S. will covertly steal resources. But the Trump administration and that was under Trump, they just ripped the mask off imperialism. They're like, yeah, here's what we're doing. And then, of course, you have this blumbering dum-dum Trump who's just going to say whatever suits his own ego. He was kind of exposing a lot of what was going on behind the scenes, just like by accident. So, yeah, that's why they were sick of him by the time 2020 came around, or one of the reasons. And, yeah.
Right. You always need the benevolent mask in order to convince people of what you're doing. And the Trump administration, a lot of times, they weren't really good at putting the mask on. They walked around and they showed the monstrous face, and finance capital couldn't have that. And so the whole establishment was, not that Trump was anything anti-establishment, right? But he and his group, John Bolton and stuff, are so incompetent that they were able to show explicitly what the real aims of the U.S. government is, which is the facilitation of the accumulation of finance capital, right? Letting finance capital through the U.S. state get whatever it wants from other countries.
Absolutely. Go a little longer with this video here. Some good information in here. Maybe one more little clip.
Now, in the original video clip that I began this episode with from CNN, the CNN Jake Tapper interview this July 12th, in that interview and also in his book, which is called The Room Where It Happened, Bolton tries to downplay his involvement and U.S. involvement in the coup attempt in Venezuela, but we know this is completely false. Bolton in his book claims that Juan Guaido organically declared himself president, and then the U.S. recognized him, but it was all the idea of the Venezuelan opposition. And throughout his book, he writes opposition with a capital O, like God, like he loves the Venezuelan right-wing opposition. Now, we know this is completely false from mainstream media reporting. Even the Wall Street Journal published an article the same week of the beginning of this coup attempt titled "Pence Pledged U.S. Backing Before Venezuela Opposition Leaders Move." And it admits that the Trump administration had a secret plan offering support for Juan Guaido. They said that it was preconceived and tightly coordinated. So in his book, which I'll talk about in a second here, Bolton lies. He claims that it was all Guaido's idea and the opposition's idea. No, it was directly planned by the U.S. government. This article was published in the Wall Street Journal on January 25th, 2019. It says, the night before Juan Guaido declared himself interim president of Venezuela, he received a phone call from U.S. Vice President Mike Pence. Pence pledged that the U.S. would back Guaido. That late night call set in motion a plan that had been developed in secret over the preceding several weeks, accompanied by talks between U.S. officials, allies, lawmakers, and key Venezuelan opposition figures, including Guaido himself. And they note that Guaido declared himself fake interim president and, quote, almost instantly, just as Mr. Pence had promised, President Trump issued a statement recognizing Mr. Guaido as the country's rightful leader. Soon after came similar pronouncements from Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Peru, and others. Now, we know this is because the U.S. planned this coup. It was not organic. It was not Juan Guaido's idea. It was planned by the U.S. government meticulously. And John Bolton was one of the key figures organizing this coup attempt, as he admitted.
I think a good point to make here, maybe the point we can end this video on, is now we're figuring all this out. We're figuring out all these details as documents have been released and as, we've gotten farther away from the coup and the propaganda campaign around the coup. And we know it was plotted by the U.S. from the beginning. It was meticulously plotted by the U.S. intelligence agencies. And they maybe changed their strategy as they went, but they had in mind their goal from the outset: overthrow the Venezuelan government, control their oil. And there were people like us, as Ben Norton mentioned in this video, being called conspiracy theorists when this happened, for saying the U.S. is doing a coup or the U.S. is attempting regime change. Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Oh, what do you think? The media is that biased? Do you think the media is lying to you? You think, everything in the world is just done by imperialism and everything bad is done by the U.S. You're full of conspiracies. And, it's easy for some people to cower away when these imperialist acts are happening because, you get so much backlash for speaking out against them. Then, a year later, after more information comes out and after a bunch of documents are leaked, or maybe 2-3 years later, then everybody looks back and goes, oh, the US planned that. It was an imperialist act from the beginning. Now I'm against it. Everybody's against imperialism in hindsight. It's like, no, look at the patterns. Look at the patterns. When there's some sort of regime change-esque effort like SOS Cuba going on in Cuba, or like this coup attempt in Venezuela, research, look at the evidence, but don't be so naive. Don't be so naive to where if somebody tells you, oh, that sounds like a conspiracy theory, the CIA overthrowing the government. Well, why? Because they've done it repeatedly, over and over and over and over again. And every time there's been smoke, there's been fire. Every time there's smoke and it looks like a U.S. regime change effort, within a few years, we'll have leaked documents gained through Freedom of Information Acts or whatever else by good journalists like Ben Norton, proving that it was a U.S. regime change effort. The tankies always seem to be right about that. So don't only be an anti-imperialist in hindsight.
That's got to be my favorite ever Eddie quote. I wrote it down before you said it because that's what I was going to say. So I'm glad you mentioned it. But you're absolutely right, man. And the hope that we can have, I guess, is that there's a notable point where people get tired of being fooled, and of always only getting to the right position only after a year has mediated between the initial event and the leaking of the formal exposure of the information. And that at some point they begin to catch on to it. And I think it's happening, but with the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine, it's been insane because a lot of people that you would expect to be able to just smell it as a U.S. proxy war in Ukraine, they haven't been able to do that. So I don't know. There's also the fact that, like, with the case of Russia, it's so unique because it's been so targeted for so long in the American psyche that, most people that grew up playing Call of Duty, like, the enemy in every game is Russia. In bad movies, the bad guy always has a Russian accent. Like, it's all over, and it's so ingrained into the ideology. It's one of those things that we don't know we know. That's how ideology functions. That's what our assumptions are. The things that we don't know we know, but that shape the way we come to know the world. But the best we can do is continue doing what we're doing, and we're always going to get called crazy, and then within a year they're going to be like, oh, those crazy guys once again were right. They've been right about almost everything, if not everything. But it's just not hard. It's really not hard because a lot of the time they use the same textbook strategies, and they just apply it to different places. Like, we know the bullshit rhetoric of human rights abuses, of abuses of democracy, if they're not Democrat. Like, we know the game that they play. That's why it's so easy to call it out. But just people don't get it, right? And I think that the most important thing we could do is not just show them the facts that show that they're wrong or that it is a U.S.-backed event going on, but give them the method through which we're able to figure that out, right? And that's what's different between perhaps like some of the journalists that provide the information, that provide a lot of the facts, and they do a really good job in doing that, and educators that are trying to give you the methodological tools so that you could do that on your own, and so that you have the methods so that you get to the conclusion without having to go on and watch someone explain it to you and explain what the position that you should have because it's the correct position.
That's a really good distinction. And I have that thought when I watch Richard Medhurst. I'm like, he's always on point, but I guess the difference between, and I love Richard's work and it's extremely important, but I guess the difference between what he does and what we do is we're trying to get you to not just look at imperialism, but then go read Lenin's imperialism, or read Marx, or understand why it is that imperialism happens, what specifically capitalist imperialism is. And yeah, like people say, why do you guys read all these ancient books from so long ago? Why don't you read any modern books? It's like, well, like you said, it's easy to analyze when there's a regime change effort because of Lenin's imperialism. Like Lenin's imperialism from 1917 still basically explains everything, still explains the imperialist world system we're in. So it's like, I'll move on to some newer books when I need them. And like, I recommend Vijay Prasad's Washington Bullets, which provides sort of an update of Lenin's imperialism. But imperialism is still the base. Analyzing capitalist imperialism using the method of Marx. So yeah, that's what we're trying to help people do, so they can, so that you won't just be an anti-imperialist in hindsight when your preferred journalist tells you to be.